Um, yeah, I thought about it because I was like, well, I use concepts and not all of them are clear, but then I don't really use that many principles. And if I do, they're implicit. Otherwise, I'd be able to just tell you. And so how much, if you don't have a stack ton of principles to deal with events, work, then it makes sense that you wouldn't be able to achieve that much because it's like, if you're doing something that's very labor intensive and doesn't require much thought, like you're on a salary and someone tells you what to do, then you don't need generalizations, you don't need principles. But if you want to climb up and achieve more, you have to, because how else can you deal with
Yes.
the complexity of everything? And I haven't really, it seems obvious, but I haven't really thought about that before. Um, and even I read that Charlie Munger has what he calls mental models, something like 108 mental models or 100.
Yeah.
And I just interpret that's basically principles. And so when he makes a
Yeah.
decision, he runs through these explicit 100 plus mental models to help him make the decision. And that just, he's managing Berkshire Hathaway. I don't know if you're familiar with. Do you know
Yeah.
about? You do? Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's pretty interesting. Like, how many people do you know have explicit principles that they could just list them from most fundamental to derivatives? I don't know it. I barely
Yeah.
know any.
Yeah. That is a hard thing to do. That makes sense that that would work. Yeah, that's something like a principle. We could, of course, discuss what exactly is it, but that's the sort of systems thinking I think is appropriate. That's what principles are supposed to do. Help you think about these wide and bits of information. And I do think
Right.
they do matter for more like growth. I think that's implied by flourishing and human nature. You don't want to be stagnant. It's flourishing is growing. It's becoming more. It's not just surviving or existing. So yeah, it would be almost like to ignore them would be to ignore growth. Like you need principles to keep integrating more and more and more. Like you're gonna learn more throughout your entire life. That goes for every single person. So at some point you're gonna need them. You might not need them when you're like 8 years old, but maybe by the time you're a teenager, then it starts to become clear that there's so much information to go in to your head. There's so much growth you need. You'll need to use principles.
Right. Yeah, I guess we have them and use them, but at least for me, most of them are implicit. And then when they're implicit, you don't know what, to the extent that you have them, they're mixed. You don't know what they are. Like it could be wind based, could be anything. Because even if I'm not clear on my concepts and I'm just acting in certain ways, I don't really know what the source of those feelings are. Right. So
Yeah.
I I think that's common. It's so hard to assemble a framework for everything.
It
Like
is.
I don't know anyone who's done that. So, but if you at least have some, that's progress, right? That
Yes, for sure.
okay. So this is about principles again.
Yep.
Okay, so this is from that essay on why should one act on principle, and I just wanted to get your thoughts on this. So, um,
Did Rand or Peacock write this?
Peacock, it's not
Peacock.
Rand. Yeah, so he's talking about why you can't be expected to read or rattle off to ourselves before every action a whole encyclopedia of past human experiences, so on. And so he says reason is what provides us with a tool to be able to condense all this information. And he says this is what's the part that they lose no information in the process. And I realize this is where I'm stuck because uh, I get that if we're talking about concepts specifically and forming concepts, you don't lose information. I think it's you omit it. You omit the measurements, but they can be animate. You retain it, but you omit the measurements. So I get that in a concept, but when it comes to principles, what I'm confused by is that there always seems to be exceptions. Like if you're talking, he later speaks about there are even public Yeah, he said there's principles of public speaking. We have them for every field of human endeavor. But they always seem, at least to my knowledge, there's always, they write about like you need to start with the rules first and then you can break them once you're an expert. I don't know if that's the
Yes.
switching contexts, but it made me think about like, well, that's the trouble I have, because what about the times there are exceptions? And so how does that mean then you don't lose information? Like, if you do get away with stealing, like I'm just confused by how have you not lost information if you can get away with it?
I'm not sure if you're using information in the right way there. Because when I
Right.
hear information, I'm just thinking of the information contained within the concept is still there. Like, I think I used the example of like origami before. Like, you can fold it all up and make it all pretty and clear, but then you could find the information within it if you start pulling it apart. Kind of like when I say, like, if I know the concept, I could then unpack it. Like, I could then make a definition. I could then come up with examples or go from there. But I mean, having the concept, it's there, but I have to unpack it first. Does that make
Right.
sense? And I don't
Um,
think, you know,
yeah, continue. I'll ask you after.
is that making sense?
I get that there's information in the concept or the principle, and you don't
Yeah.
necessarily discuss it. But I guess, yeah, you're right. I'm looking at information as like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I'm just seeing like, okay, well, there are principles and they work some of the time. That just seems to be my
Yes.
overall, they work is sort of,
Yeah.
but they're not. So to me, it's like, I'm thinking that does mean information would be lost. It's like a rule of thumb almost, where it's not perfect. It doesn't
Okay.
capture everything if you act on it, but it's like supposed to most of the time help you. But then I'm confused by like, okay, well, aren't there exceptions where like, no, it's not going to help you and you got to do something else? That's where I'm
Okay.
getting stuck.
Okay. I see your question now. Like, it's like maybe they're just imperfect. They capture a lot, but not everything you need to apply it.
Yeah. That's what I'm thinking of.
Okay. So exceptions. If I were trying to put that into at least objectivist epistemology, the way I would answer that is um, it's not that there's an exception, but it's a different context, or the principle should not be applied in that context. There's something different about it, unlike where you usually use it. There's something different. And by you have to identify what the difference is. I
Right.
think that's usually the answer you would go to.
Okay.
I'm trying to
So
think of any times there you would need like an actual exception in the same context. That would be, I can't think of one.
yeah, I mean, I know it's floating if I can't give
Yeah.
examples, but that's what I thought. Maybe like, so principles work all the time, except it depends on certain factors being in play. That's
Yeah.
just like the boiling water example that you gave ages
Yes.
ago, where like, yeah, the rule is water boils at 100 degrees, but that's only within the context of a certain altitude. And so you're saying that it's the same with principles like do not steal or whatever. But there are certain factors that need to be present for that principle to apply. Otherwise, it doesn't. But in the
Yes.
case of moral principles, um, uh, there's less maybe factors that can change because you're dealing with human nature, something like that.
Probably.
So,
That would sound fair.
okay. So
Sounds good.
it's not that there's a loss of information then, it's that principles apply within a certain context, and that context includes, should we call it causal factors? I don't know if that sounds too abstract, but includes certain things that need to be true for that principle to apply. Like, if you see a bee, um, and you apply everything you know to a bee about it, that's fine if you're on Earth. But maybe this is a terrible example. I just can't think of a good one.
Yeah.
But if you're on some other planet and you see something that looks like a bee, but it's blue, then maybe you're like, okay, maybe it doesn't, maybe what I know about bees doesn't apply here.
Yeah, that would be fair, I think, because you're in a different context and all your knowledge about bees is now wildly different. Because if there's another planet, it's like you might even wonder, does that have even the same biology as I expect? So even anything you think about animals might not apply. Like, are they
Right.
sentient beings? Do they make concepts? Do they have? Are they flying out to greet you from their extravagant cities? Who really knows, because it's a wild new context. The things you knew just don't apply here. Like you're in a new territory.
Okay, so it's not that I get now there's not a loss of information. It's that principles are contextual, and there are certain factors that need to be present for the principle to apply. But when they're present, it applies, and that's that. So I was going wrong there on the omniscience kind of premise or whatever, where like
Yes.
I still have that thing of like you can know everything in advance perfectly or something.
Mm-hmm.
Unfortunately, though, it's not. That's an easy example, but it's
It
harder
is.
than to start thinking about like um, moral principles and like, all right, so how do I really validate that? How do I validate that this is true all the time? That that's less clear to me, but that's a different question, I guess. So
Yes.
we answered this one.
Yeah, that gets into induction and certainty. I mean, those are relevant questions, but that's a lot more to discuss. It's a different kind of question.
This is the next question then. Well, it's not
Yes.
fully. I think it's related to induction because it's like I
Yes.
get all men are mortal, right? I don't know. Is that a
Sure.
principle, or would you say
That's
that's
I would just call that a proposition or a
a
fact.
proposition? Okay, because it doesn't. Well, when would I call something a principle? Like all men are mortal. Doesn't that guide like you can die, so you have to take care of yourself. So
Um, just because I use principle usually to connote um, like rules of thinking or some kind of rule of some kind.
okay, like something that will exactly tell you how to take it. Is the virtue a principle? Like if I say integrity, is that a principle or just a virtue? Like when does it become a principle?
I would say that virtues are types of principles.
Oh, okay,
That's how I would put it.
right. All right. Yeah. So all men are mortal, and he's saying it condenses a vast sum of wealth
Mm-hmm.
and information. I see. Yes. Okay. I get how it's valuable to have. Like, obviously, it helps you function to know this. And that one I believe too. I'm like, yeah, I'm not gonna try and fly or something off my 14th story. Like, I just know this is true. But
Mm-hmm.
why is that one? That one's like compared to everything else, that's an easy generalization. But like all the other principles to me are just not at all. I don't know why that, because I get that this one's also an inductive leap. Like, I could say, well, I'm different or this is different. I'm not that person or any other person in history. But there's something about this principle and generalization that is so easy, but everything else I just find like impossible to hold with that same vividness. Like if I get a cut, I'm reminded, or if something happens, like I'm hurt or I have an injury or whatever, like I'm reminded of, or I have some medical issue. But it's not the same with any of the other principles. And that's what I'd like to like. It'd be amazing, but I just don't see why is that one so easy and everything else so ridiculously hard? I don't know if that's a good question,
Well,
but
which one's so easy? The all men
well,
immortal.
all men are mortal versus uh, honesty, integrity. Um, what else is honesty, integrity, self-esteem? Like all of those just seems like suddenly you're jumping far away, and like I don't see them with the same vividness or any of that. They're all just floating.
Yeah. Um. Well, why is it easy? It probably has to do with, well, just that it's more concrete. Like men being mortals. I mean, you can think of people dying, think of people being born, people being killed. I mean, you probably will see it more directly. It's not that far from
Yeah.
the perceptual level.
Right.
It might also be easy. Well, there's different arguments there probably. Like, why is it easy to believe certain things? Depends on the philosopher. I mean, they might say that it's closer to innate or like Kantian, like those base concepts. You might say something about that, or Hume might say it's more emotional because it's closer to our feeling and sentiments when we think about death and life. They
What
might
is
say
it?
that. Hmm?
Okay. I didn't get Hume's argument, but anyway.
Well,
So
he's more
different
about
people.
sentiment and feeling. Like the feeling is where your principles come from, or the feeling is why you might think something. That's not your reason that guides you there. That you feel something first, then you think about it.
Oh, okay. So feeling, sensation leads to feeling, leads to thinking, something like that.
Something's like that. And of course, Rand would say that probably would be easy because it's more concrete and perceptual. It's more immediate to. It's less
Right.
abstract than
Right.
those other things.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess you'd need to have some way to really concretize. It's still really hard to think of like so many different varying scenarios and experiences to come up with like, oh, I can see how that's true in this context. But yeah, I
Yeah.
guess that makes sense. It's less abstract. Um, what did I want to ask you? I forgot. There's something. If I remember, I'll ask you again. I can't remember now.
Sure. I like that. I saw at the end of that quote, like, I'll appoint a subcommittee to decide the rest. Like, it
What?
just maybe the end of
Which?
that quote was funny to me. I'll appoint a subcommittee to work out
His
the rest.
all his stuff is funny. I really enjoy
That
reading
was
his.
genuinely funny.
Yeah, because he talks about he does make it seem really funny. He talks about them, the U.S. people, U.S. politicians discussing regulation of car trade, and he makes them look so ridiculous. It's just saying we cannot be simplistic, and then like we take this concrete out, put this concrete in. Should we regulate this of Chrysler, and then the car, and then the Toyota people are screaming. It's all just
Yes.
he manages to really show how crazy it is when you've got no guiding principle to guide
Yes.
any of your thoughts. But I do also understand the perspective of like you don't know, like it's so hard to see how abstract guiding principle, if it actually will work or apply in a certain situation. Like it's
Yes.
just not easy at all to concretize. So
Mm-hmm.
let's see what else. Okay, this is the extremism again. Let's see. Yeah, so once you've compromised with whim, you suddenly surrendered the principle. But like I don't see it. I mean, that's that kind of black and white thing of once you've done one compromise, you've now completely surrendered. But maybe he means just in that context you've surrendered. I again, it goes back to I don't know how to evaluate when someone has surrendered a principle. Like, is it one compromise or two? You know, but this is a repeat issue for me. So which
Yeah,
I've,
I think that's just a repeat thing of just the way Rand and Peacock word things. So I mean, I think that's just an ongoing thing. Always, you need to find your own way to answer it. But I've always answered it. They're not being quite reasonable, but we have to think of it in terms of a regularity or a policy of thinking that way, not just an instance of it, but that it's their means of functioning, not just a one-time violation, but habitually done.
yeah, right. And so it'd be same in this, right? Because he says you can't modify, he's talking about the judge who sometimes um, modifies justice by a dose of political favoritism. And
Yeah.
then so he says that nullifies it completely nullifies the term justice. So I was thinking, well, if justice can't countenance a single act, even one makes the whole system unjust, then I would assume neither can rationality. So as soon as I check my phone, I'm irrational. It's the same issue, like
Yeah.
where I'm not clear on it. But anyway, that's the same thing. So, all right, we can probably jump to some virtue.
Okay.
I'll just quickly see if I can bring up the other stuff. Maybe I'll remember what I wanted to ask you before. Okay, motivation, because I was thinking about that and I realized like motivation is a feeling. Like the term makes me think of, someone like jumping out of bed, training, getting excited. But I realized I don't think you need motivation to act. I think, one sec. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah. I was
Listening.
thinking about it. I wanted to get your thoughts. So yeah, motivation refers, it's a kind of emotional energy, and it's either motivation by love or motivation by fear. That's what I got it down to after I thought about it. And so you don't need to be motivated to take an action. So I guess you can just have a thought and act on that thought. And there's no need for any sort of emotion to it. It's just like, this is good for me. I'm going to do it. I guess there's probably always some level of emotion if you have a thought, but it's not motivation in the sense of like I think the concept comes about to differentiate that kind of like someone who's excited versus someone who's dragging themselves to do things. Like you could definitely say that person's not motivated,
Yeah.
and that person is motivated. And yeah, so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. Like, so you don't need motivation. Helps because it's an energy, but you don't need it. Is sort of what I was thinking about. You can be dictated. You can
Yeah.
be directed by thought and pure will.
I think of it differently.
Okay.
Like I don't even like I get that usage. I think it's more because of my psychology perspective that I don't think it's wrong what you're saying. I just don't like that word choice. I think the way you're thinking of it is fine. But I've usually thought of motivation in terms of like just a state of pleasure or non-pleasure, that they're just sensations within you that I guess it's similar. We're not completely different concepts here, but I think it more in terms of like that is a motivation there still. If your acting is just low motivation, there's still a goal seeking behavior. Like whatever sets off that motivation or whatever sets off the behavior, I would call motivation or energy that is needed for that to set off that behavior, whatever it might be. So yeah, you could say that you have low energy or low motivation if you drag your feet out of bed, but it's still motivated in some basic primitive sense. Like you need food. I mean, that could be enough of a motivation. Or you need to use the bathroom. That's sufficient motivation or sufficient thing that activates your need to act, or it's enough to get you to start acting.
Yeah, I was thinking about like, can I differentiate having a reason to do something versus having a motivation to do something? And I said yes. But then I also agree. I guess the tricky part is that there's multiple senses in which the word is used. Because, there's like when someone commits a crime, that what is it? Motive, means, and something else.
Opportunity.
Yeah, motive means an opportunity. Yeah. And motive can be, it doesn't mean the person's excited and they're jumping out of bed and they're like, yes, I'm going to kill this person. Woohoo. And they're like doing, pull-ups and all kinds of stuff. I think in that context, the sense is that there's a reason. And so I think that's what I was thinking of. Like there is that concept motivation, which does seem to differentiate between something you observe in people, like someone who is really excited about what they're working on there's someone who's dragging their way through some task. And then there is motive or motivation in the sense of, do you have a reason to do it? And yeah, I mean, I guess I can't tell if an emotion is always at play. I haven't been able to like introspect, or I haven't been aware of like, am I always driven by emotion? I can't, it's hard for me to tell because I don't always, I notice when I have a strong emotion, but not a weak emotion. But so that's why I've sort of left it as an open-ended question. Like, do you always need a motivation, some level of motivation to push you? Or can you be driven by a reason, just purely a reason to some extent? Like, I don't really feel like doing this. I don't feel anything, but I'm just going to go get up and I don't know. I need to think about that one
You
more.
could have
But
like motivation on the one hand and motivator on the other hand, just to add clarity. Like the motivator
right,
is a thing you go after, but the motivation is the sensation, perhaps.
right, right.
And you would just measure like to what degree do you feel that
Yeah,
motivation. You could call it like low motivation or type, or how many reasons you have, or like how cognitive is it? Like, is your reason like, oh, you've thought a lot about it, like you don't want to eat this because I don't know, you have, you know, it will happen, and or you're saving room for later because you have a big party later and you're gonna eat a lot. Then that's more than, I mean, that's a reason, but it's not like you're just did it out of no reason at all. I don't think there's no reason or no motivation ever. I don't think
right,
there's such a thing.
right.
But we can talk about um, how much is thought about.
Yeah, I think you're right. There probably is some level, like if you're thinking conceptually, there's some level of emotion all the time. But this is all speaking about it. Like the way to tell would just be for me to observe myself.
Yes.
Um, but I can't, I'm not able to tell like, oh, right now I'm experiencing this or that. Only when I have a strong emotion can I tell. But anyway, I agree. I think there's motive, which I sort of say is reason, and then motivation is that strong emotional energy captures that.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that one before I go on to virtue. So I think this is the same thing we've discussed. Like, he says this largest subcategory are Peter Keating's people who hold a legitimate job but drift through it out of focus, exercising no judgment, reaching no conclusions, merely imitating the motions around them. Like maybe, but I'm not perceptive to pick. I don't notice any, like, as far as I'm aware, a lot of people seem to be driven. This was written a while ago too, but as far as I'm aware, people do seem to be driven quite independently. Most people, basically everyone I've met really, and mate, yeah. So I don't know, but do you
Um,
have any thoughts on that? Most people being Peter Keatings. I mean, like I had a lot of, I still probably do have a couple of Peter Keating elements. I had a lot in the past, but like I don't notice that in people around me much. Maybe in small little things, but not as a subcategory of person.
yeah, I'm not. I think I used to think it was more common than it really is,
Yeah,
because I can't give you. I can give you a lot of examples. It's not rare, but it's not as common as I think Peacock might have you believe.
well, even when you see it though, it's just a small element usually, right? It's not the entire. It's not
Yeah.
a massive. I don't know. I just I haven't noticed that. So okay. So integrity, discuss independence now. Integrity is loyalty to rational principles. Let's see. Okay. So holding the full context. So it requires, so I think this is integrity. On the contrary, to keep one's, oh no, so he's talking about thinking. So on the conceptual level, you can flout your knowledge and it's not in a, like you can escape your knowledge. And in order to keep your value judgments, to highlight the term, operative, you need to be in focus, and you need to hold the full context of your knowledge, retain the perspective of a long range purpose. And only if man functions, so you can hold the context of all morality and do so by the guidance of principles. But I thought isn't that what they were saying about art? Art's supposed to help you hold all of those in mind. But I'm like, but now you don't need it. You can just use, I get that art could be fuel, like it gives you some motivation. But I actually thought the role of art was also to help you hold it in a concrete form and go, that's what this philosophy is. But here apparently you don't need art. You summon up the context, and you just somehow you go, okay, well, here's the moral principles. Here's what I need to do. Yeah. Am I misunderstanding something?
I mean, I would say art also does it.
Okay.
But I would argue that it's necessary to have the concrete, because it's saying art should provide a concrete to think about. A principle might not necessarily. I almost think of it as like the concrete examples are what art has. That's what art gives you, or gives you all these ways of thinking, or different people, or different psychologies, or different examples of all these things. So I think it being a specific example is critical to retaining all this information. Like the
Right.
principle you should have art could help you add concretes to that principle and make some more immediately accessible, or some easier
Right.
to think about.
Okay. All right. So the claim is that it just makes it easier. Like you can hold the context in mind, but I guess I need to experience this myself. But you can have like, if you have, so you can hold the principles abstractly, but if you have art, not only is it supposed to fuel you, but it does perform this function of making you think better about it. Like this is so subtle. Like to be able to go, oh yeah, that's true for sure. I guess you really need to see if it's true yourself.
Yeah, that one's tricky to demonstrate. I think it would take time to just make those connections, like to say that it's required, or I mean, I could see somebody could argue, well, art is nice, but it's not necessary. But I actually would argue that it's necessary, but that would be probably a complicated argument. Like
Right.
why not only is it good, or not only is it beneficial, but required.
Right.
And that's a
Uh,
harder argument to make.
okay. I want to ask you something else, touching on art. So, so if words, like imagine if you had a word, but it didn't have a concept, then it's useless, right? Like it's just a word, it's a noise, it has an emotional vibration, but
Yeah.
it's not tied to anything. What happens if you read a book and it gives you the word? So the word is the art, but you don't have the concept, meaning the philosophy for it.
Um. Well, it would just be a noise, I guess. I mean, I don't know
Or
how
just
else
an
to interpret
emotional
that.
experience that that that
Or like
doesn't, you can't do
onomatopoeia,
anything with.
like you just see boing, doesn't mean anything. It has no meaning. It doesn't refer to a concept or idea. It's just a sensation, and it'd
Yeah,
be
but I
like
mean the
that.
art,
Like
like
I
that,
guess it.
the analogy would be you read some fiction book and you love it, but you don't know what the philosophy behind it is, and there's nothing
Um.
about it. That's what I mean, because that's the equivalent of a word without a concept. If we're stretching her definition of art to mean like, concretizing moral abstractions, then it would be
Okay.
like you the final process in concept formation is assigning a word or a symbol, and the final process of concretizing a moral abstraction results in a word, which is basically a piece of art, right? Like that's the concrete of the moral abstraction, using her analogy. You following? And
I
then
think
so
so.
imagine if you had, like, you read a fiction and you love it and you respond to it. It's just like you hear a word and you're like, that's a cool word, but you don't know what it is. So what happens then if you read, like, because I'm asking this because I've often read fiction and I like it, but I wouldn't be able to tell you what the philosophy is. I don't know.
Mm. So
Because I have no words to
when you
explicitly
like it,
identify.
but you don't know what it was philosophically.
Yeah.
Um,
That's what I'm talking about.
what is
Or
it?
even if you hate it and you don't know what it was philosophically, like what happens to a person then? Like if they just have the words but they don't have the concept in that, in this art analogy.
Would anything happen psychologically? I'm trying to think what would happen other than they wouldn't be able to think more. It would seem think more on the subject. It would seem to me that if you loved a book and you don't know why you loved it, you should just figure out why. It seems like that would be a good thing to know or understand about your psychology and your
Right.
interaction with the world. It seems like that'd be a
Right.
reasonable thing to do. Like if you don't get it, go find out why.
It's not
Um,
always it's not always easy. It's like
no,
there are books that I've liked. I wouldn't be able to tell you, even if I wouldn't be able to tell you what the philosophy was.
yeah, but I think at least I think you're right. You'll sometimes not get it or understand why it mattered or anything. It just means you gotta take time to think about it if it's important. Like certain movies, I like to think about more that something was captivating about it and pushes me to want to think about it more. Like The Matrix would usually do that for people, for example. They might not
What
really
would it
get
do?
what's going on, but this nature of what if reality is a simulation? Or what does it mean to be in control of my own actions? I think people might not always immediately know why is that movie interesting or why is it cool. But I
Right.
think you could easily find the philosophical principles. And some movies do or movies or books do a really good job at that. That they're
Yep.
good at communicating that feeling of unknown and getting you to then think about it. I can think of plenty of movies like that. The ones that people like the most, like say Dark Knight Returns, probably that people really thought about that. They know why they liked it, and then people think about it more. The Joker, and that was a huge movie last year, and people wanted to think about why did they like it, what about it was about society did I want to hear. I think you're just motivated sometimes to look for the answer.
Right. After you watch it, you're like, what is going on? There's something in this, and you start
Yeah,
looking. Yeah. Okay.
it's
But
what I've experienced
identifying,
at least.
but that might mean you need to get new conceptual knowledge, even though there's something like
Right.
there's the material there, but you don't have the capability to put it together into like conceptual form.
Yeah, I can even relate that to like sometimes reading about quantum physics is cool, even though I kind of like what's going on here. It doesn't make sense. There's something like I can get enough to know it's something cool, but also I don't know enough to really say anything about it other than this seems interesting. I don't know what this word means at all. It's like
Right.
gobbledygook. It doesn't mean anything, but I know
Yeah.
it does mean something. So now I might be motivated, like this basic sense of like complicated thoughts, but still trying to be coherent about it might be an appeal that you look into it. Or there might be something like, oh, there's something here. I can't really point it out, but maybe I'll go learn a bit about it. Which I mean, I in the past, like as a personal example, like when I didn't understand quantum physics, and I still don't really, but it led me to other people to read or think about. Like
Right.
Richard Feynman, it was interesting seeing his thoughts on how to think about quantum physics or anything else. So it like I started to see why it was that it seemed interesting. It was something about like finding something new or learning a new context that really shapes your understanding of the world and
Yeah.
also his way of thinking. You don't always think in terms of what you're used to. So it started to get at like I guess epistemological principles. Like that's what it was interesting. That's what I liked. And I knew enough then by like, oh, maybe I'm not going to explore quantum physics as much as I thought, but I see why it was interesting, or I see
Right.
what in it I think is valuable.
Right. And what about I'll just what about what did you think the Matrix caused people to think about? Like that's the cave, right? Plato's cave, but they might not have known that. But
Yeah,
what do you think the Matrix triggered?
I think the cave was a big part of the
Okay.
Wachowskis when they wrote the movie.
Oh, right,
Um,
right,
I think like taking your life in control, or taking control of your life, like the
right.
whole red pill, blue pill thing, then taking that,
Yeah. That's
that
a
really
that's a
people,
thing now. Red, are you gonna
yeah,
be red pill or blue pill?
yeah, it's just used in so many contexts. Like it has affected the culture in a way that not only are people curious, but I think it made them think harder about what it means to make a choice.
Right.
Or even this whole concept, like, is anything real? Well, the simulation bit is fascinating, and I don't know, it was a good way for people to get a philosophical idea,
I,
but still being an action movie.
I think that was my favorite film actually, when I
Yeah,
was younger. I tried to bend
yeah,
spoons afterwards, but
yeah,
yeah, but it's interesting because I guess there is that choice, right? Like, so it's kind of like it is about choice, part of it. It's not the whole thing, but like he
yeah,
does make a choice. He can go back to whatever the normal world, or he can discover something new. So there is a bit in there. I didn't think about that, but then
yeah,
the Dark Knight and the Joker and all that, I'll stop so we can
yeah.